Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today is part 2 of our top 10 coffees of 2022 list. And a quick reminder on how this list works is we can only use the same coffee roaster twice, as well as the same coffee origin twice in our top 10. Yesterday's video featured coffees 10 through 6, as well as our honorable mentions. And today's video will feature coffees 5 through 1, including our first place finisher, which I have brewed right here, and I will be sipping on periodically throughout this video. Of course, there is a review of every one of these coffees currently up on this channel, but let's go ahead and get started with our 5th place coffee, which is the Obraje, a wash processed Colombian coffee from the barn. And this is my first ever coffee from their Masterpiece series, and it will probably be my last, given that I had some issues getting the coffee I wanted from their Masterpiece series. But that doesn't take away from how much I enjoyed this coffee, as it offers the best of all worlds in terms of the vibrancy of a natural processed coffee, as well as the clarity of a wash processed coffee. This one scored a level 5 in terms of the cleanliness. And if there's one coffee I could say reminded me the most of pineapple juice, it is this coffee right here. But it didn't stop there, as this coffee offered wonderful depth and complexity in the tropicality itself, at the same time also offering wonderful florality within the cup. So it hit the big 4 of my favorite types of things within coffee, that of course being the clarity, sweetness, florality, as well as fruit components present within them. So for that reason, it made it one of my favorite wash processed Colombian coffees that I had ever had. Massive props to the barn, as I really enjoyed this one. 4th place, we have the Altieri Alessa WX, a wash processed Panamanian geisha from Coffea Circulor. And this coffee was featured in our 2022 Cafe Box Advent Calendar series, where it finished as my favorite coffee from the entirety of that Advent Calendar by a very wide margin. And that isn't surprising whatsoever, given that this coffee was very much my type of coffee right from the onset. And this was my first ever wash processed Panamanian geisha that I'd had from Coffea Circulor. And for that reason, the expectations were extremely high, given I'd had such positive experiences with them as a whole. And this one didn't let me down in any sense, as interestingly, it offered much more of a stone fruit forward cup of coffee than I think I was expecting. It had plenty of the florality, as well as the clarity that I was expecting from a Panamanian geisha, but given that it skewed very strong in the peach direction, that was actually a really nice selling point to me, as it still continued to offer great depth and complexity and wonderful sweetness as well. Everything I'd hoped for in this coffee. I think the only thing that held it back from possibly finishing higher in this top 10 list is the fact that I only had 50 grams of this coffee, whereas I had much more of all of the other coffees featured in our top 3. So for that reason, it had potential to finish higher, but I was really impressed by this one. I look forward to hopefully trying another one of their washed Panamanian geishas in the future. All right, speaking of washed Panamanian geishas, our 3rd place finisher is one as well, as we have the Tumaco, the Hacienda La Esmeralda from Passenger Coffee out of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And this coffee right here was one of my favorite coffees at the start of the year, and I had very high expectations for this one as well, given that Passenger is one of my favorite coffee roasters in the entire world. And this one offered my favorite flavor profile in the entirety of coffee. It's that grainy, sweet citric component that I often describe as fruity pebbles. Once I worked through this coffee a little bit, I was able to get that in such a wonderfully clean and vibrant, pronounced manner. But in addition to that, it offered some nice depth and complexity for a Panamanian geisha, especially a Hacienda La Esmeralda one, as for the first time I'd experienced this kind of vanilla-like creaminess to the cup to really kind of contrast the more citric components typically present within Panamanian geishas. This one, of course, scored very high in terms of the clarity, in terms of the sweetness, so it hit on my 4 big marks as well. And I can easily say that this was one of my favorite washed Panamanian geishas that I have ever had. All right. Seems like a perfect place to take a little break, so let's go ahead and take a sip of our 1st place coffee. All right, and in 2nd place, and one of the coffees I have so much to say about, it is the Geisha WX, a wash processed Ecuador from Coffea Circulor. And I already know that this one won't stand, so I'm going to go ahead and place it down. But I'm actually going to start discussing this coffee by discussing a different coffee that was featured in our honorable mentions list, and that was the Lugmapada, wash processed Ecuador from One Line Coffee. And I was so impressed by that coffee, given the immense sweetness that was present within the cup, that I actually went out to look for some more Ecuadorian coffees that also had the Típica Mejorada variety. And I came across all of these coffees from Coffea Circulor, the Wave, and the Nebulae, which also finished in our honorable mentions list. And that really demonstrated just how much I was enjoying that variety. And I put 4 of Jose Pepe Jijón's coffees all in one blind taste test, and this one finished first in that blind taste test, and one I dubbed the most luxurious blind taste test I had ever had. And what really set this coffee apart from 3 other really impressive coffees was the fact that this one offered both of my 2 favorite things that were present within the last 2 coffees I mentioned. It had the fruity pebbles-like component. At the same time, it had the wonderful stone fruit-like component. So 2 of my favorite flavor profiles in the entirety of coffee, while at the same time maintaining absolute immense clarity, absolute immense sweetness, a very easy to brew coffee that remained pretty consistent throughout, continued to improve for the entirety of the time drinking it. This one was ridiculously impressive. Given the standard that the Ecuadorian coffees had set for themselves at the start of the year, it's really impressive how many Ecuadorian coffees ended up in this top 10 coffees of the year list. This one right here, one of my favorite geishas in general, just really impressed by this coffee all around. All right, and I'll take one more sip before we discuss our first place finisher, which will be a very, very controversial first place coffee. And the coffee we have in question is, of course, the Pepe Jijón, a TyOxidator wash processed Ecuador from Manhattan Coffee Roasters. And I think a lot of the reason that I feel this coffee might be controversial is because this was a very tricky and difficult coffee, and it was featured in that same blind taste test I just mentioned, and it actually finished 3rd on the first impression of this coffee, as honestly the thing I was getting forward the most from it was this herbality to it. And it left me scratching my head for a little bit, as I could not seem to get this coffee right for a very long time. So I guess the question is, why did this coffee finish first place? And I think it's because when I look back on 2022 and ask myself which coffee was the most memorable, it's going to be this one right here. And the reason for that is, once I did get this coffee right, with a lot of adjustments, a lot of tinkering, I was able to get a sweetness that I had not experienced from pretty much any coffee we'd ever reviewed up to this point. I think famously in that video I said that it would score at least a level 6 in terms of this sweetness, as I described it as being the sugar at the bottom of a soda can. If you just drank an entire soda and you'd put a bunch of sugar in the can at the start and you got to the very end and it has that sugar, that's what this coffee reminded me of. And it did have an interesting herbal component towards the end. It did have an interesting citrus, but if anything, it was that really unique sugar component that really made me remember just how interesting this coffee was. Here's I'm drinking it today. I wondered, was this coffee really as good as I remembered? And the answer is actually yes. This coffee sets the benchmark for the future, as now I've really been seeking out the Típica Mejorada variety, given just how much I enjoyed this coffee. The sweetness that it does offer is what I'm looking for. It's unique. The other coffees we have featured in this top 5, they all seem to run along the same sort of profiles. Of course, that clarity, sweetness, florality, as well as fruit components. But this one right here, while it has decent clarity and it has decent fruit profiles to it, and it doesn't necessarily have the most florality to it, it offers one thing that the rest of the coffees don't, and that is an insane level of sweetness and a very unique sweetness. So for that reason, I felt that this coffee was just unique relative to everything else we have, not just in our top 10, but the entirety of the coffees that we had reviewed this year. This one really impressed me. I am looking very forward to reviewing more coffees with this Típica Mejorada variety, as this is the year it really made an impact on my impressions of coffee as a whole. All right, so that right there is our top 5. I would love to know your guys' top 10 coffees as well, or just your favorite coffee in general for the entirety of the year, as I really appreciate all of that feedback. And I would love to hear some feedback from you guys on these coffees as well. Is my first place finisher as controversial as I find it to be, given that I know a lot of people didn't necessarily enjoy this coffee? I know it was a very difficult to work with coffee, but I really think that this coffee was one of the most defining and important coffees of 2022, in my opinion anyway. But yeah, this has been an absolutely wonderful year. Of course, I'm looking forward to doing this again next year. I'm looking forward to starting our review series again as well. So I wanted to thank all of you guys for the support throughout the entirety of the year. Every single time you guys have contributed, it's been greatly appreciated. I love discussing coffees with you guys all of the time. But I'm actually just going to leave this one right here because we have so much more work to do, so many more coffees to discuss, and so many more opportunities to do so. So if you guys enjoyed this video, as I always say, give this one a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. And this right here has been part 2 of our top 10 coffees of 2022 list. Thank you for watching.